So good morning, everybody, and thanks for coming to this session. It's technically kind of, apart from the keynote, the first one of the day. How many people went to the keynote this morning? Anybody? How many people went to the party and didn't go to the keynote this morning? So at least some people are honest about what they're doing. So I went to some of the party. I hope you had a good time, but I had an early bedtime because I wanted to make sure I was in top shape for this presentation this morning. So thanks for coming. This session is about AWS infrastructure automation. My name is Paul Duffy. I'm joined here by Chris Munns. We're both members of the solutions architecture team based in New York City. And our job is to work with customers like you who are thinking of deploying solutions in the AWS cloud to make sure that you're doing them in a way that takes advantage of all the building blocks that AWS offers in the best possible way and that you set up for success. So Chris is going to take a seat for a little while, and I'm going to start the presentation and tell you a little bit of what this is about. So what do we want to cover today? Well, obviously, there's something about operations that we're going to talk about. We want to help you understand some of the things that are a little bit different with AWS from all of the operations stuff that you've been doing, no doubt, for a number of years, and make sure that you're well set up for success. Now, I don't know how many of you had a chance to go to Andy Jassy's keynote yesterday, but a lot of the things that he was talking about there about the cloud, these things are different than how you would have necessarily done things on-prem. There are things that are going to be the same in the way that you might manage an operating system stack and the way you might have to do configuration items there. But there are many new things that AWS offers which require a slightly different approach, some different tools for you to manage. So what we're trying to do here is help you understand some of these things that are different and set you up for some success. We also wanted to clarify the counterpoint to that. What is this session not about? What are we explicitly not going to cover? Just so you make sure you're comfortable that you're in the right room. So we're not going to cover a deep dive on any specific tool. Now, I'm hoping no one puts their hand up to the next question I'm going to ask. Did anybody go to the boot camp that Chris did earlier in the week? I hope no one. Good. So Chris spent 7 hours on Tuesday just focused on this kind of operations topic. We have today 50 minutes to do that. So we're not going to be doing a deep dive on any specific tool. We're going to talk about some of the tools, like we said in the abstract, that are going to help you out here. But we're not going to be spending 50 minutes just zoning in on one specific tool. And also, as we don't know all of your environments intimately, we're not going to give you some prescriptive guidance for exactly the things that you need to go and implement in your own environment. Those things are all going to be a little bit different. We're aiming to set you up for success, understand some of the tools and some of the different things with AWS, and make sure that you can go off and hopefully have success in your deployments. So the specific things we are going to cover, we're going to introduce and spend some time talking through and giving you a demonstration of AWS Cloud Formation, which is one of the built-in services that we offer at AWS. We're going to think about some of the high-level constructs in AWS and how they mean that you need to think about things a little bit differently. And then we're also going to cover two additional tools, Chef and Puppet, and help you understand how those will also fit in to your deployment. So what kind of things does AWS give you? Well, when Andy talked in his keynote yesterday, one of the things he mentioned was lots of building blocks. Lots of building blocks that you can use and you can use together to build solutions that you deploy in AWS. Now, some things are new to manage. Probably nobody in this room is unfamiliar with what has to be done in a data center. Chris spent a number of years in that environment, racking and stacking, doing cabling kind of stuff. So there's a bunch of stuff that people are used to managing. But with AWS, there are new kind of constructs. There are new things to manage which are different. When Andy talked in his keynote yesterday, and he talked about things like server provisioning, it used to be that you were measuring this kind of thing in days, probably unlikely to be days, but you were measuring it in weeks or maybe even months. You were ordering a physical server, which at some point would turn up into a rack. You might be doing virtualization with it. You probably will be nowadays. And you would ultimately deploy software on it and manage it in your physical environment. It's very unlikely in that old world that you were doing some kind of command line or API-based thing for some abstract type of computing resource, which is the way that we do that with AWS when we start to think about provisioning things like servers. So these things require a slightly new way of thinking. Many things are different. Things like virtual private cloud. These kind of things didn't really exist in the physical world that people have been used to in data centers. But yet many things are still the same. So the skills that you've developed in managing operating systems and so on, whether that's the Microsoft set of operating systems or Linux-based ones, those things are still the same. But what we're focused on today is just understanding how you approach managing some of those different things. So first of all, we're going to talk about the structural components in AWS. And what we mean by those are things like security groups, EC2 instances, virtual private clouds, things like RDS, our relational database service instances, Route 53, our DNS service, record sets associated with that. So we're going to talk about some of those things to start with before we start to look at some of the things that are host-based a little bit later on. And we also wanted to consider this in something of a practical way. Another very important thing Andy mentioned yesterday, he talked about how things can very, very quickly become global now. We start off, for example, with an application or an environment that we've deployed in North America. Let's say the application that we deploy has been very, very successful. It's what people are generally hoping for if they deploy those things. And you want to replicate that in Australia. We just launched a new region there a number of weeks ago. In the old world, doing that would have been very, very difficult. You've got to somehow take this infrastructure, you've got to go and not only are you worried about the configuration stuff you've got to do, but you've got to establish some kind of relationship with a hosting provider maybe in Australia, do commercial stuff, make sure it's the same kind of hardware or hardware that you're comfortable with, and do it. That was complicated. But we try and take a kind of an abstract way of looking at it. So it sounds hard, and indeed it was hard. What it really sounds like you want to do in terms of the way we might use the words in AWS is to manage a stack. So we're going to introduce AWS Cloud Formation now. And before I hand over to Chris, who's going to go into some more technical details of it, they say a picture's worth 1,000 words. I think a scenario is certainly worth 1,000 words. So we're going to do a demonstration of Cloud Formation before Chris starts to talk. And the scenario that I picked for this, because I think it's quite an interesting one, is live video streaming. It's very pertinent to some people who've been watching the event here via a live stream. How many people in this room use live streaming, out of interest? Many? So the live streaming scenario might not be relevant for everybody in the room, but what we are going to do and build in this demo probably is relevant in some way to everybody in this room. So to do a live streaming event, the kind of things that we need some kind of compute instance that in this case is going to run Adobe's FMS server to do that streaming. We need some security groups. We're going to have a CloudFront distribution configured with our content distribution network. We're going to have some DNS records and some other configuration metadata. Now, back in the old world, it might have been complex to get that done. We're going to show you a simple way of doing that. So I'm just going to switch over to my demo laptop here. Just give me one moment. So what you can all see here is the AWS Management Console, and particularly the CloudFormation Management Console. So there are a number of stacks that are already running in this environment. What I'm going to do now is just look at this 1 second. I'm going to create a new stack, which I'm going to give a name. And I'm going to upload a template file in here. So this template file, Chris will go over in a little while. It's basically a JSON file with a whole bunch of things in, which will include parameters that I'm going to be asked to input, a set of resources that it's going to build for me, and ultimately a set of outputs. What this is asking me now, first of all, is from the key pair that I'm going to use that I've created earlier, which is called pdef demo. It's going to ask me for an admin password for the Flash Media server that we're going to deploy. Put the password in. It's going to ask for a username, which I'll leave as it is. And the only thing I'm going to change here is the type of instance that we're going to use with EC2. This is a very, very simple demo we're going to do for a small number of people, so I don't need large instances. I'm going to choose a smaller one. That all looks right. I don't need to put any tags in here. And it's summarizing here, what am I calling the stack? It's giving me a description of the stack, which creates something including CloudFormation, using an EC2 AMI for Flash Media Server, for live HTTP streaming. It's got the parameters I put in there, and I'm going to start that off now. So that stack is in the process of being created now. You can see that it says create in progress here. And if I go to look at the events tab there, I can see that it's starting off, it's creating the stack, and then it is going to do, in the right order, create all of those things I need for my live streaming session. So it's going to create security groups, it's going to create instances. Let's just see how it's progressing. Yeah, it's on the way to creating the security group. Now, this stack will take about 12 minutes to provision everything fully, so we're not going to watch that in process. Now, what we are going to do is come back when it's finished. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Chris, who's going to spend some time talking about what CloudFormation is and reviewing the results that you're about to see a bit later. So, Chris.
Thanks, Paul. On here? Hello? Hey, good morning, everybody. So thanks, Paul. Paul just kicked off a quick demo here to show you what CloudFormation is capable of doing, but what's actually going on behind the scenes. And we're going to talk a little bit about what CloudFormation is and how you work with it today. So CloudFormation allows you to easily create and manage collections of AWS resources. Those resources are going to be the things that typically you'd be interfacing with via the management console, command line tools, APIs. This is the full range of things from EC2 instances, security groups, VPC subnets, RDS instances, IAM users, simple queue service queues, and et cetera. It's very easy to create these templates. We'll see a brief example of that in a moment here. We also have a lot of samples online. So if you go to the CloudFormation documentation, you'll see that we have, I think, something around like 50 different sample templates that do everything from creating Active Directory domains to setting up full WordPress stacks to setting up a couple of really interesting applications that we see a lot of heavy use cases for. You interface with CloudFormation via the management console, APIs, or command line. It's very easy, again, as Paul was saying. You don't have to worry about dependencies and what order they come. The document structure is actually pretty loose. And then lastly, one of the key points that everyone loves is that it's free. So you don't pay anything extra for using CloudFormation. You just pay for the resources that you fire up with it. So 3 key points to take away here about CloudFormation. You use templates to describe the AWS resources. You modify and update those resources in a very predictable and controlled manner. And one thing that's really nice about these being text-based files, it's very easy to version control your infrastructure. So my question for you is, have you ever been able to easily do this in a physical data center? As Paul said earlier, I have background doing physical data center work. I've racked and stacked many servers, more than I'd ever like to probably remember. I've done wiring, I've done cabling, I've kind of seen the full gamut of all of that. I couldn't probably easily describe all the things that I've done in a text-based document, but with AWS and with AWS CloudFormation, this becomes something that's very easy to do. And you can see how maybe using CloudFormation and updating it to update your infrastructure, you very easily can see a history of changes across your infrastructure. Taking a CloudFormation template and putting it into something like a source code revision control system, something like Git, SVN, you'd be able to see who did what, when, why, and the full differences between those different things. So it's a very powerful thing to have. Okay. So the process here is you make a template, you pass that through CloudFormation, and then you end up with provisioned resources. So we didn't see the make the template part in Paul's demo here, but we saw the putting into CloudFormation. In a couple minutes, we'll see the stack fully stood up and running. So let's look at the anatomy of a template. I don't expect most of you in the room to be able to see exactly what is going on in this template here. This is a very basic template to start an EC2 instance. But what I do want you to take away from this is that there are 5 key parts to a CloudFormation template. There are the headers, parameters, mappings, resources, and outputs. Headers, there's not too much to say about here. We have a version of the document. Right now there's only one of those. AWS hasn't had a second version to the document yet. And a brief description, usually, of what the purpose is of this template file. But let's look at some of the parts of the demo template that Paul just started for us. So in one of the first screens, right after Paul went and uploaded the template, there were a number of questions, basically, or parameters that he had to fill out. You saw him give it a name. You saw him pass in a password for the FMS application. So with the parameters part of the CloudFormation template, this is really what allows you to have a very dynamic flow to your CloudFormation templates. It allows you to reuse them many, many times, but build your stack slightly differently. We saw him pass in an instance type. We saw him pass in the password. So this here is actually the example block for that password. We can see that it has a type of string. The variable here for no echo basically will treat this as a password field, so you'll never see it again. It'll just be little stars like you would normally see in a web application when you were putting in your password. And then we can set constraints around min length, max length, and allowed pattern. There's a description of what this field is, and then below you can see at the bottom there's a constraint description, such that if you weren't actually going to, when you filled this in, you didn't meet the restrictions there, it would prompt you saying that you had to meet that. Next up are mappings. Mappings are a really, really powerful part of CloudFormation. Paul was talking about what do you do if you have your infrastructure running in North America and you need to move it to Sydney. With CloudFormation, being able to map something like regions to AMIs, this is very, very easy to do. So AMI IDs, it's a globally unique namespace, so you never have the same one in another region. It's completely unique around the globe. But that doesn't mean that you couldn't still have basically the same AMI, at least as you had defined it, in every region around the globe. So what we're seeing here is an example of an AMI that exists in all of these different regions. And when the CloudFormation template runs, we'll see in a little bit here how it looks to see what region it's in, and then it would execute launching the instance based on one of these AMIs. There's a EC2 resource, obviously, that Paul had to fire up for this. This is a brief example here of setting up an EC2 instance. And you pass into this the same properties that you would if you were launching this via the command line tool, the console, any sort of other third-party console that might be launching an EC2 instance. So we see here that you have properties for availability zone, if it's going to be EBS optimized or not, the image ID, the instance type. This is the actual block here from Paul's template that gets launched. And I realize for those of you in the back, it's probably going to be a little small and hard to see. But breaking it down from the top to bottom, we define the type of the resource here, which is an EC2 instance. There are a number of properties, some of which were passed in by Paul, and those are referenced via the ref in front of another property there. And then down at the bottom, for those of you on the front here, you probably can see a little bit better, it's actually a bash script that we pass through to this instance when it starts. And so that bash script is actually going to handle some of the configuration and setup of the instance after it's installed. And this is one of the really powerful parts of CloudFormation in helping you get a fully automated system around turning up this instance and being ready to go. Then we see, again, because this is a video streaming demonstration here with CloudFormation, we have to create a CloudFront distribution. So CloudFront is AWS's CDN service. You can do video streaming with it, normal kind of CDN things that you would be doing here. So in CloudFormation, this is very, very easy to establish a CDN distribution. Those of you who work with other CDN providers, how easy is it for you to get in touch with them to create a CDN distribution? For a lot of them, it could be a phone call, an email, a ticket you have to put in. With AWS CloudFront and CloudFormation, it's as simple as these 10 or so lines right here. So what we're seeing is that this resource has a name, live streaming distribution. There's an origin that we're going to point it at, an HTTP port, an HTTPS port, the origin policy, whether it's enabled, and a comment. And that's all that you need to instantly have access to the 38 POPs that we have around the globe capable of helping you stream your content. And the last section in the CloudFormation template were the outputs. Outputs are actually going to be the results of what it is that you do in your CloudFormation template that you might need to access. So there are three here: FMS server, FMS URL, and stream. And these are values that Paul's going to need later on when he actually does the demonstration of the live streaming. There's a lot more, so we're really just kind of scratching the surface here. Let's say that you needed to create an RDS database. With RDS, it's, again, very, very easy to do. What we're seeing here with the, again, in quotes, the ref and then the value name after that are references to other things that we're passing into this part of the template. So when we saw the parameters before that Paul was filling out, how you would reference those in the template is via this. So what we're seeing here actually are 7 different referenced parameters that have been passed in. So what you can think about here is if you had to launch a number of RDS instances, maybe you're standing up a development stack per developer. Traditionally, this is something where you'd potentially build out the resources bit by bit. But with CloudFormation, it's very easy to pass this in. You can even have them do it. Right? So when it comes up, they have a database instance named for them. They can pass in the username and password. You can figure out how much storage needs to be allocated, this type of the instance. And so looking again here at, and then things such as the security groups that would be needed for this. So it's very, very flexible, very, very dynamic. These do not need to be statically typed templates that are difficult to change or relaunch. An example of a security group, again, the instance that Paul launched is inside of a security group. This is just a brief example of setting up a security group to enable SSH access to an instance. So just like you would have done probably from the console or the command line, you have a from port, a to port, the site or IP range. Very, very straightforward. And if you needed to add this into a VPC to make it a VPC security group, it's as simple as just referencing the VPC inside of it. So speaking of VPC, if you needed to create a VPC with CloudFormation, it's as easy as these 4 lines. So again, going back to my background of being someone who spent a lot of time in data centers, a lot of time in physical infrastructure, if someone were to come up to you and say, you need to create a siphoned off part of our network infrastructure for a certain environment to live inside of and do it very quickly, how long would that take you? Potentially days, potentially weeks. You know, new equipment needs to be set up, it needs to be connected to different things. With with CloudFormation, you could have a VPC, a siphoned off portion of our environment in the cloud for yourself very, very easily. Really, really big part of CloudFormation is metadata. So we're talking about metadata here, and again, my apologies for those of you in the back. Part of CloudFormation is something called CloudFormation init. So we saw that bash script before. That was an example of user data, but with CloudFormation, you also have the ability to find metadata around EC2 instances. And this can also live inside of auto-scaling groups. So with this, there are a number of handlers that CloudFormation can act upon when your instance starts up. There's a packages handler, a sources handler, commands, files, services, users, and groups. They do pretty much exactly what they sound like. The packages handler will install packages on your instance. The users and groups handler will create users and groups. The sources handler will actually take a remote file that you pointed at that is either a tarball or a zip file, and you say a directory on the instance that you want to pass that into. So what's really cool about this is you can actually point part of your CloudFormation template at a GitHub repo and have it download the master from that GitHub repo and uncompress it into a directory. So if you have any sort of dependencies that rely on outside resources for your application, it's very easy to pass those in. This is an example here actually of that packages handler. So what this is going to do is reference the yum command on the system. So for those of you from the Linux world and Red Hat and related distributions, you use yum to install packages normally. So this template here would be based for an AMI that supported yum. If you were on a Debian or Ubuntu, you would use apt. There's handlers for Windows also. But so what we see here with yum, we're installing these 4 packages. And so once the instance started up and Cloud init ran, it would go ahead and do this for you. So again, when you work with CloudFormation templates, it's very, very easy to do. We saw an example of the web console here. You can also pass this in via the command line or API tools. If you're doing it via the API, it's as simple as a single line. So you can see how you could even take CloudFormation templates, the automation that they provide you in setting up a stack of resources, and automate that as part of another process. So automating the automation of setting up your infrastructure. So we're going to go back over to Paul here real quick and see how our demo's coming along.
Thanks, Chris. So I'll just get back to my laptop and see where that has got to. So we can see the AWS Management Console is here, and that stack that I created earlier, it's all green, create complete, so it's done that kind of work. And if we have a look at that stack, in the Events tab there, if you remember, we started at the bottom when it was doing the stack itself and the security group. This way it's gone all the way up. We've got the EC2 instance that's there. We've got the CloudFront distribution, and the stack is ultimately complete. So that's gone from nothing in the time that Chris was talking to an environment that's ready to do some kind of live streaming. So what's the next step for us to do? So Chris mentioned that there were 2 things more than two things, but two important things in that template. One was a set of parameters that I gave it in terms of the size of the instances that I wanted, the password that I gave the FMS server. But then there was also that section for outputs as well. So if I look at the outputs I've got for my stack here, some of these are specific to this particular environment for live streaming, but I see things like the address of the admin console for this. I also see things like the FMS URL. So here is an RTMP connection string that I can take, go over to my media encoder here, and I can just put this straight in here. So with one click, I'm connected to that media server. I just had to copy and paste that. I could have done that potentially in an automated way and served it to someone somehow differently. And I can start that stream. So in a couple of seconds, it will start streaming that up to my FMS server. So we know the stream's going there. Might be nice just to see that it actually works. So we can also find the manifest file that we need here. And we have a demo Flash Media setup page that we've got here. So we're going to put that URL in here. Yep, we're using live streaming. We don't need this. What we should hopefully see is something that might not be what you want to see in your live video stream. But you know, I know that I'm good at some things and not good at others, and I clearly don't have a career for live streaming, so we'll stop. Yeah, I think we probably want to stop that streaming for now. So there are some things in Vegas that stay in Vegas. And this is one of those things. So once we finished doing that, so we went in 12 minutes from going from nothing to having all of the infrastructure that we needed to do a live media event. Now I said, when I asked the question about how many people use live streaming here, it wasn't like the whole room put their hand up. But unless you're accidentally in the wrong room and that you thought you were at the luxury travel conference upstairs, I guarantee that pretty much everybody here can understand how CloudFormation could fit in there. Everybody who's dealing with infrastructure has some kind of stack. It might be development stacks like Chris is talking about with database instances, but lets us go from nothing to something in a very short period of time. And then at the end, click delete. Say they want to delete it, and now CloudFormation is doing a good job of cleaning up all those resources and taking them away. So I wasn't paying, when we went into this room, I wasn't paying for a stack sitting there waiting for my event. I spun it up when I needed it. I had my very small event in this case, and at the end of it, I removed the stack, and by the time that instance is gone, no one is paying for anything there. So that's the end of that part of the demonstration, and I hope that people can see how that might be relevant in their environments. So what if we wanted to take that stack to Sydney or somewhere else? And the fact is, it's very easy. You take that template. The parameters are going to be a little bit different for an event maybe in Australia. You're going to give it a different name. But fundamentally, you build your stack. You build this script. Keep it in some kind of version control system. But like Andy said in his keynote yesterday, now the ease that you can take a stack that you start off in the east coast of the US, you want to move it over to Sydney, very, very simple for you to do that. So CloudFormation helps with lots of these AWS building blocks. Almost every AWS service you can get through CloudFormation. You will expect to see more and more of that as time goes on. And there are a variety of different things that you can provision or modify. Some of the things that we saw here, EC2 instances. We can also modify stacks whilst they're running. So it's not just about creating them and getting rid of them. So all of the kind of things we thought we needed in that stack, very, very easy for us to do. So that's some of those structural things I talked about. What are some of the other things that we might need to do in that environment? So these things are not going to be a surprise to anybody who's ever done any kind of operations. It might be patching operating systems. It might be pushing new versions of code out. It might be changing a configuration setting. It might be doing something to a very specific pool, a very specific part of your environment. Still things that you need to do. Could you do this with CloudFormation? Yeah, you probably could do most of that with CloudFormation. But it's potentially difficult to do at scale. CloudFormation is a very useful tool for the kinds of things that we saw there, for creating stacks, for modifying stacks, and so on. But you know, you want to install a package just on a certain set of hosts. in your environment. You need to change the LDAP config on certain EC2 instances. A little bit more difficult to do that with CloudFormation. So CloudFormation really needs a sidekick here to help out doing some other things. And that sidekick is called host-based configuration management. So at this point, I'm going to hand back to Chris, and he's going to talk through what that really means and what that might mean in your environment. So Chris, back to you again.
Thanks, Paul. So host-based configuration management. So we saw with Paul's demo that we were able to do everything that we needed to for that individual project, that streaming distribution demo with CloudFormation. But as Paul was just saying, there are some things that you would need to do, as you all know, in your day-to-day lives dealing with infrastructure that CloudFormation just isn't really best tuned to do. So we're looking for another tool here that can kind of fill in some of those gaps. So we'd like something that would potentially be running on host continuously to help us with the management of that instance or that host. It'd be really powerful to have a central point of knowledge or control. We would still want something to play with our version control practices. Again, being able to see when a change was made, who made it, very, very useful and powerful for you. And it'd be great to have a really flexible framework. A lot of people, I won't ask for people to raise hands here, but I'm sure a number of people in this room have some really, really dirty shell scripts that do a lot of very interesting things in your infrastructure. And so here we're going to talk about some tools that are kind of Swiss Army knives of operations work, such that maybe you can get rid of some of those shell scripts. I won't ask you to get rid of all of them. I know everybody loves their shell scripts very dearly. But kind of like Werner was talking about today, there are people who hug servers, but those servers don't hug you back. Your shell scripts don't hug you back either. So there's two options that we're going to discuss today, Opscode Chef and Puppet Labs' Puppet. We're not going to go too much into the differences between the two of them. They can both perform the similar tasks. They both run on the complete variations of different operating systems, Windows, Linuxes, FreeBSD in some cases. And they're really used pretty much the same way. They have slightly different philosophies. They have slightly different syntaxes. But we would spend a whole lot of time today, and it would become kind of a religious conversation to discuss the differences between them. So it's not something that we're going to go too deeply into. But I do really, if you're not using these tools today, I suggest you spend some time looking into them to figure out which one might be best for you. So what is Chef? The Opscode people say that Chef is an open source systems integration framework built specifically for automating the cloud. What is Puppet? Well, the Puppet Labs people say that Puppet is an IT automation software that helps systems administrators manage infrastructure throughout its life cycle, from provisioning and configuration to patch management and compliance. So if we take a second to kind of sit and ruminate on this, it sounds a lot like AWS CloudFormation. So there are definitely a lot of similarities between the two, a lot of overlap, but there are some key differences between them. So with CloudFormation, it runs as part of the AWS platform. It can manage all of the AWS resources that CloudFormation is capable of managing, from EC2 instances to security groups to VPCs, et cetera. But it can only help you manage those resources. So CloudFormation is not something that you could take and run in your own environment if you're in a hybrid or another cloud or some sort of other data center environment. And it's built and maintained by us here at AWS. But if we talk about Puppet and Chef, these are things that only would run on server hosts, so on your instances. You can't take, for instance, Puppet or Chef and run it on an RDS instance or use it to set up a CloudFront distribution. But it can help you manage those servers pretty much anywhere. So what's really great about these tools is you could use them to manage your servers on AWS, on another cloud, on-prem, wherever else you might have infrastructure today. And it's really important to note, there are some skeptics about these types of software. Both Puppet and Chef are maintained by real organizations, real enterprise companies. There are a lot of really big users of these. Both Opscode and Puppet Labs are very strong partners of AWS. So together you have a really great solution. So with CloudFormation, you can create, update, and manage your AWS resources and their configuration and properties. Then with something like Chef or Puppet, you can go a little deeper on instance Bootstrap that will run, configure the host to whatever it is that you pass into those to do. And then in an ongoing management lifecycle, you're using Puppet and Chef to handle things like those tasks that Paul was talking about before, updating software, installing new software, installing the latest versions of maybe your application code, tweaking kernel parameters, things like that. So really full end-to-end configuration management control here around automating your infrastructure, everything from VPCs to setting up Apache, to creating users, to creating RDS instances, to anything you could think about that you would normally be doing hands-on with some sort of a operating system or with a server, you could do with these tools. All of it version controlled. Again, it's really, really powerful. If you currently are not using version control software in your environment for those gnarly shell scripts that you have, really, really recommend that you get into the habit of doing that. It's extremely powerful to see what changes were made, when they were made, why they were made, who made them. And both of these two different things here, CloudFormation and Chef or Puppet, play in with that really, really well. So what does the flow look like in putting the two of these together? From an abstract here, you need CloudFormation to install Chef or Puppet and all their dependencies. You need it to then configure Chef or Puppet on the instance, so set up a configuration file potentially to point it at, in the case of Chef, perhaps a Chef server, and Puppet, you have the Puppet master. And then continue to use CloudFormation to create your AWS resources. On the instance side of things with Chef and Puppet, you need them to run when they first start up, reach out to whatever the centralized sources that they're talking to, perform the tasks that they're set up to perform, and then you use those things to ongoing manage those instances. So using Puppet and Chef later on to do more things once the instance is up and running. So what does this really look like under the scenes here, talking about CloudFormation and how you tie the two together? There's something else real quick here that we're going to stop to think about. For those of you who were in Werner's talk, he spent a lot of time talking about autoscaling. Autoscaling is a very powerful service here at AWS. Some great customers like Pinterest were up there talking about earlier today. And there's a couple things that you really need to do well in order for autoscaling to be very beneficial for your infrastructure. So we have to talk here a little bit about bootstrapping. So bootstrapping is the action of what actually happens when an instance starts up. It's what's going to happen from the point that that OS has booted and is running for you that will go up until the point where it's ready for you to use in production. And I don't mean necessarily production being the live place that you get traffic. I mean production from more of a state of this instance is up and running and usable, whether it's in a dev environment, a QA environment, or a real prod environment. So bootstrapping here, you want this to be as automated as possible. You don't want there to be manual intervention. Oh, wrong button. So again, talking about manual intervention, there's probably a lot of things that you do in your day-to-day if you're working in a physical data center that are a lot of manual intervention. So what type of things are we talking about automating? Everything that's up here on the screens, right? So you don't want to be copying data. CloudFormation and Chef or Puppet can handle that for you. You don't want to be opening up a port, in something like IP tables or Windows Firewall. Again, something that CloudFormation, Puppet, or Chef can be doing for you. You don't want to be updating packages, mounting EBS volumes, registering with DNS. Anything that you would be doing manually. Think about yourselves right now, what it takes for you to get a server up and running in your environment. If there's a single manual step, a single time that you have to log on to that host, that is in the way of you being able to really easily do things such as autoscaling. So there are a few different approaches, though, that come in with this. And there are three real key points to an AMI, or key kind of gradients of an AMI that you could use with automating the building up of your infrastructure. And we're going to look at them here on a gradient. I think it makes it a little bit easier to kind of picture where they are. So starting at, I guess, what is your guys' far left there, you have a fully functional AMI. So this is an AMI that you're going to have basically almost everything bundled into it already. So maybe you've already used a CloudFormation template and something as Chef and Puppet to set up that instance, and then you've made it an AMI, such that when that instance launched based on that AMI, there's only going to be maybe 5% of the work left for a Chef or a Puppet to do. And if you talk about wanting to do autoscaling and very rapidly turn up instances, you need an AMI that's a little bit further on that spectrum there towards a fully functional AMI. The middle ground there, a partially configured AMI, maybe you have a base AMI that you've set up that has some things right out of the box that it can do in your infrastructure. Maybe it needs to talk to your LDAP environment, maybe it needs to add some management users, such that when you turn it up, if for some reason Puppet or Chef weren't running, you can still access that instance. And then the last far end of the spectrum here is having just a very base OS. So when we talk about portability, and we were looking at the mappings before, that could have been a completely blank, out of the box, Amazon Linux AMI, Windows Server AMI, and then you would rely on CloudFormation or Chef and Puppet to do most of the heavy lifting and set it up for you. In terms of working with something like autoscaling, you would have a bit of a delay then, waiting for this instance to kind of, get fully warmed up and have everything installed on it before it would become functional for your application. So actually looking here at what this looks like with CloudFormation, in this case we're just going to show how you would go about setting up Chef Client on an instance. So we have a CloudFormation resource here called Frontends. You could think of it as your front-end web server. So it is a type EC2 instance. We pass into it metadata. We see here that we're using the packages handler. We're using two functions of the the packages handler. One is Yum, the other one is RubyGem. So you can have CloudFormation install Ruby gems just like you could packages with Yum here. So for this CloudFormation template, Chef is built on Ruby. So we're going to install Ruby 1.9 and some of the other packages that are required there. And then the Ruby gems we're going to install are Chef and then Ohio, which is another component of Chef. In terms of files, we need to set up the configuration file for Chef Client. So this would be for a Chef client that is actually talking to a Chef server somewhere. And so what we have here is a very straightforward file that we pass in using the filers handle from the metadata. And what we can see, there are actually two reference fields that we have in the middle where we call a get attribute. And what we're getting in this attribute here is a Chef server URL that this client is going to need to talk to. Then we have a file that we need to define the role of the instance, or actually, sorry, the run list of this instance. And the run list is what Chef is going to do once it starts up and has talked to the server, pulled in its cookbooks that it needs to configure the instance itself. And then lastly, we actually need to tell CloudFormation to run Chef Client once the instance starts. So after it's completed all the other parts of installing the packages, setting up the configuration file here, if you look down towards the bottom here, I'm sorry again for those of you in the back, you'll see a line that we actually use to call Chef Client. We pass in that first run JSON that we established in the previous slide that you saw here. Above and below here, what you're actually seeing are some other functions that CloudFormation can handle. So we see something called Chef Client Wait Handle. With CloudFormation, when you're setting up various different resources, it's going to try to very quickly establish them for you. But if you need to do something out of band from the AWS aspects of turning up the resources, such as run software on a host, run commands, do something such as bootstrap an instance with Chef clients, you might want to wait for this to finish before other resources will be fired up. So in this case, what we've told CloudFormation is run Chef client and then hold back on doing anything else until after Chef client is run. So really the full big utopia picture here is to not be super obsessed about what your AMIs are. You know, again, Paul and I, based out of the New York City office for AWS, spend a lot of time working with large enterprises, small startups, kind of everything in between. And I spend a lot of time talking about AMIs. A lot of time people worried about that, golden base image that they're going to have and that they're going to bring with them. And what happens if I lose it? What happens if somebody deletes it? Well, using something such as CloudFormation and Chef or Puppet, you could recreate it at any time, right? So you want something like CloudFormation and Chef and Puppet able to take that base OS, the AMI that we were talking about before, and get it as close to a fully functional AMI as possible. And this is going to be the thing that's going to enable you to take benefit of things such as auto-scaling for your environment. And then, again, putting these all together, it's really easy to do full stack environments here. So we were talking before about the example of maybe needing to stamp out a stack per developer. You could think about maybe you have different QA or dev environments for different products that your company might have. Maybe you're talking about needing to do multi-region, right? So if you need to do multi-region very quickly and rapidly, it's something that is very difficult to do if you weren't using a tool such as CloudFormation or Chef and Puppet. Andy talked a little bit yesterday about the Obama campaign and their heavy use of AWS. They had a very great story that they talked about before Hurricane Sandy came and hit the East Coast. They were concerned about what the storm might do. So they were able to move their infrastructure from US East to US West in, I believe, under 24 hours. This was several hundred instances, a lot of applications, and they were able to move it with the help of things such as CloudFormation. And I don't remember if they were using Puppet or Chef, but I know they were using one of them to help with that. So I'm going to hand it back over to Paul now.
Thanks, Chris. So in closing, we hope you found this session useful. We looked at what these tools are, how CloudFormation works with other things like Chef and Puppet to be your kind of toolbox for having the best kind of operational experience with AWS. And what we would recommend is spend some time to understand these tools. It's definitely worth the investment into learning them to make sure you have the best experience. and favor the kind of the best practices we have for dynamic kind of configuration and Chris's utopian view of being AMI agnostic. So thanks for your time. We hope you found this useful. This is the first user conference that we've done. So